A futuristic city was once promised to stretch across the desert for 170 kilometers, designed to house 9 million people inside mirrored walls. Today, only 2.4 kilometers of that vision is expected to be completed by the end of this decade. To make room for it, thousands of residents were removed from their homes, and one outspoken protester was killed after resisting eviction. At the same time, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund recorded losses of $8 billion linked to its flagship megaprojects. What happened to Vision 2030? Was this an unavoidable correction, or the cost of trying to compress decades of economic change into a single moment? To understand how this moment emerged, the story must step back and examine what Vision 2030 was created to solve in the first place. For decades, Saudi Arabia's economic model was built on a simple exchange. Oil revenue funded public employment, subsidies, infrastructure, and social stability. As long as global energy demand remained strong, the system appeared durable. But beneath the surface, it created a structural imbalance. Most private economic activity depended on government spending. Productivity outside the energy sector remained limited, and job creation lagged behind population growth. By the middle of the previous decade, pressure began to accumulate. Oil prices collapsed in the mid-2010s, sharply reducing state income in a country where hydrocarbons still provided the majority of fiscal revenue. At the same time, demographics were shifting. A young population was entering the labor market each year, while the public sector could no longer absorb new workers at the same pace. The old model was still operating, but its margins were narrowing. Vision 2030 was introduced as a response to this vulnerability. Its stated objective was to reduce dependence on oil by creating new sources of growth and a more diversified economic structure. The plan emphasized expansion of the private sector, attraction of foreign investment, and development of industries such as tourism, logistics, advanced manufacturing, and technology. It was presented not as a short-term stimulus, but as a long-term transformation of how the economy functioned. At the center of this strategy stood the state itself. Rather than withdrawing from economic activity, the government chose to accelerate change through direct investment. The sovereign wealth fund became the primary engine of this approach. If private capital moved too slowly and foreign investors hesitated, the state would move first. It would absorb risk, build infrastructure, and create entire markets in advance. This approach reflected both confidence and urgency. Confidence drawn from decades of oil income and large financial reserves. Urgency driven by the belief that time was limited. Each year of delay increased exposure to energy price volatility and deepened the challenge of providing meaningful employment for a growing population. Vision 2030 therefore functioned not only as an economic program, but as a social and political commitment to future stability. Embedded within this strategy, however, was a critical assumption that capital scale and speed could substitute for gradual development. That cities, industries, and markets could be constructed faster than trust, skills, and demand normally emerge. This assumption shaped the execution of Vision 2030 from the very beginning. As the next section shows, the first signs of strain did not appear because Saudi Arabia lacked ambition. They emerged because ambition alone could not override economic sequencing. Vision 2030 rested on a bold premise. If gradual change was too slow, Saudi Arabia would compress decades of development into a single generation. Entire cities would be built from nothing. New industries would be designed before they existed. Capital would move first, and economic activity would follow. This premise gave rise to the Gigaprojects. The most ambitious of them was NEOM, a vast development zone along the Red Sea presented as a testbed for a post-oil economy. Within NEOM, the central concept was the Line, a linear city planned to extend 170 kilometers and eventually accommodate 9 million residents. It was marketed as car-free, carbon-neutral, and powered by advanced technology. The message was unmistakable. Saudi Arabia was not merely diversifying, it was attempting to leap beyond existing global cities. Other projects followed the same logic. Qiddiya was designed as a global entertainment destination. Trojana was introduced as a mountain tourism hub. Mukab, a massive cubic structure in Riyadh, was meant to anchor a new downtown district. Each project was framed as transformational and urgent, not incremental. At first, the strategy appeared internally consistent. Saudi Arabia possessed land, capital, and centralized decision-making. Unlike fragmented systems, projects could be approved and launched rapidly. The Public Investment Fund became the vehicle through which capital was deployed at unprecedented scale. But once implementation began, constraints emerged. Timelines extended as designs grew more complex. Costs rose as technical challenges multiplied and global supply chains tightened. Labor shortages and material inflation added further pressure. The line, originally presented as a continuous urban system, was gradually scaled back. By the end of this decade, only a 2.4-kilometer section is expected to be completed. What had been promoted as a complete city became a symbolic fragment. Similar adjustments occurred elsewhere. Mukab was paused, and its completion pushed far into the future. Elements of NEOM were redesigned or delayed. The Sovereign Wealth Fund later recorded billions of dollars in write-downs linked to revised assumptions and cost overruns. These outcomes exposed a deeper flaw. Gigaprojects are not only engineering challenges, they are economic commitments. For such developments to succeed, they must attract residents, firms, and visitors willing to pay for what is built. Demand cannot be declared into existence. It must form gradually, supported by labor markets, supply chains, and social networks. In this case, capital moved faster than demand. Infrastructure preceded population. Fixed assets were created before revenue streams were secured. The underlying belief was that scale itself would generate economic gravity. Instead, scale magnified risk. This was not a failure of ambition or design. It was a failure of sequencing. Productivity follows people, not the reverse. Markets emerge where incentives align, not where architecture is most dramatic. As the limits of the Gigaproject model became visible, the costs were no longer confined to balance sheets and construction schedules. They extended into the social fabric of the regions where these visions were imposed. Behind the architectural renderings and official announcements, the expansion of the Gigaprojects carried a social cost that remained largely absent from public promotion. To clear land for the line and other developments within NEOM, entire communities were removed from areas they had occupied for generations. Villages were dismantled. Homes, schools, and local services vanished within a short period of time. More than 6,000 residents from several villages in the northwestern region were displaced to make way for construction. Some accepted relocation under pressure. Others resisted, arguing that the land represented not only property, but identity, livelihood, and history. Their opposition was not treated as a negotiation over compensation or timing. It was treated as non-compliance. One of the most visible opponents was Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti, who publicly criticized the eviction orders through online videos. He was later killed during a security operation. Official statements described the incident as a confrontation. Human rights organizations and international observers disputed that account and linked his death directly to enforcement of forced displacement. His case drew international attention and became a symbol of the human cost embedded in the development strategy. Repression extended beyond a single incident. Dozens of individuals were detained for opposing the removals. Many were charged under security-related laws. According to documented reports, several remain in detention, and a number face the possibility of capital punishment. The response established a clear boundary. Opposition to the projects would not be absorbed into the planning process. It would be eliminated. This pattern was not confined to NEOM. In Jeddah, another redevelopment initiative connected to Vision 2030 led to the demolition of entire neighborhoods. More than 1 million residents were affected as districts were cleared for new commercial and residential construction. Accounts from displaced families described limited notice and inadequate compensation. Social networks that had formed over decades were dissolved in a matter of weeks. From an economic perspective, these actions carried consequences beyond immediate displacement. Development relies on more than capital and land. It depends on trust, participation, and legitimacy. When communities experience growth as coercion rather than opportunity, social cooperation deteriorates. Long-term productivity becomes harder to sustain. Vision 2030 aimed to prepare Saudi Arabia for a future beyond oil. Yet in these moments, it exposed a structural contradiction. A plan designed to modernize the economy relied on methods that weakened the social foundations required for durable growth. As criticism intensified and social costs became harder to dismiss, another constraint emerged with increasing force. Even with oil revenues, the financial limits of the existing approach were becoming unavoidable. As the technical and social costs of the gigaprojects accumulated, a more rigid constraint began to dominate decision-making. That constraint was fiscal reality. For all the language of diversification, oil continued to finance the state. Hydrocarbon revenue still accounted for the majority of government income. When energy prices were high, this structure appeared manageable. When prices softened, pressure emerged immediately. Vision 2030 required heavy upfront spending long before new sectors could generate reliable returns. The gap between cost and payoff widened. By the middle of the current decade, this imbalance was visible in the budget. The government projected a deficit of more than 100 billion rials for the year 2025. The following year, the shortfall was expected to increase further. These deficits were not the result of sudden crisis. They reflected a structural timing problem. Expenditure accelerated faster than diversification could deliver revenue. The Public Investment Fund sat at the center of this tension. Originally positioned as a strategic tool to support transformation, it increasingly faced the demands of a commercial investor. Losses from delayed and resized projects reduced flexibility. At the same time, the state relied on the fund to finance development, support confidence, and indirectly stabilize public finances. This dual role created strain. Capital committed to long-term domestic projects could not be easily redeployed. Unlike global portfolio assets, megaproject investments were illiquid and politically difficult to reverse. Once committed, funds became locked in place. Oil income provided temporary relief, but not resolution. Using energy revenue to sustain projects without near-term cash flow postponed risk rather than eliminating it. The strategy assumed a favorable window in which oil prices would remain sufficient until diversification matured. That window narrowed as spending accumulated. Fiscal pressure forced a reassessment. Vision 2030 itself was not abandoned, but its financial logic began to shift. The emphasis moved away from projects defined primarily by scale and symbolism toward activities capable of generating measurable returns within a shorter horizon. Time, once treated as abundant, became scarce. This shift raised a new question. If monumental development could no longer absorb unlimited capital, where should investment flow to sustain growth without exhausting the fiscal base? As fiscal pressure intensified, Saudi Arabia began to adjust its course. The shift was not announced as a retreat, but it was visible in how capital was redeployed. Investment gradually moved away from projects defined by symbolism and scale toward sectors with existing demand and clearer revenue paths. The Public Investment Fund started to reduce its emphasis on large-scale real estate-driven developments and redirected resources toward logistics, mining, advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and data infrastructure. These sectors differed fundamentally from the earlier gigaproject model. They did not rely on speculative population growth or future urban density. They were tied to markets that already existed. Logistics emerged as a priority because geography offered a tangible advantage. Positioned between Asia, Europe, and Africa, Saudi Arabia aimed to capture trade flows rather than create them. Investments focused on ports, airports, rail corridors, and industrial zones integrated into global supply chains. Unlike new cities, these assets could generate usage and fees soon after completion. Mining followed a similar rationale. The government publicly estimated the value of untapped mineral resources at approximately $2.5 trillion. Phosphates, bauxite, copper, and rare earth elements moved from the margins of policy to its center. Rising global demand for materials linked to energy transition increased the strategic value of these resources. Technology investment also changed in character. Rather than experimental urban environments, attention shifted toward data centers and computing infrastructure. Plans focused on building large-scale data capacity powered by domestic energy resources. The objective was not to redefine urban living, but to sell processing power and digital services to regional and global markets. Tourism strategy narrowed as well. Instead of relying primarily on newly invented destinations, greater emphasis was placed on religious tourism. Pilgrimage already brought millions of visitors each year to Mecca and Medina. Expanding capacity and services in this sector offered predictable demand rooted in long-established flows. At the same time, the role of the private sector increased. Risk sharing replaced full state underwriting. Some projects were slowed, resized, or removed from priority lists. Where private capital hesitated, that reluctance began to inform decision-making rather than being overridden. This strategic pivot did not represent abandonment of Vision 2030. It reflected a recognition of its limits. Economic transformation could not be achieved solely through speed and scale. It had to align with incentives, demand, and institutional capacity. The question now was no longer whether Saudi Arabia could imagine the future. It was whether the revised path could sustain growth without repeating the excesses of the first phase. To understand the meaning of Saudi Arabia's shift in direction, it is necessary to place Vision 2030 alongside the experiences of other resource-rich economies. Oil wealth alone does not determine outcomes. The decisive factor lies in how capital is allocated, how risk is distributed, and how time is treated. Norway offers the clearest contrast. Like Saudi Arabia, it built modern prosperity on hydrocarbons, but instead of using oil revenue to rapidly reshape its domestic economy, Norway pursued a slower path. Most energy income was invested abroad through a sovereign wealth fund designed to preserve value across generations. The objective was not acceleration, but insulation from volatility. Returns accumulated gradually while domestic economic change followed existing institutions and labor markets. This approach produced stability. Norway avoided sharp fiscal swings. Its pension system remained funded. The fund was not required to create jobs, build cities, and stabilize the budget at the same time. Its role was singular and clearly defined. Saudi Arabia chose a different strategy. Capital was concentrated domestically in an effort to force diversification. The motivation was understandable. Employment creation, social stability, and global relevance could not be outsourced. But concentrating investment inside the domestic economy also concentrated risk. When assumptions proved optimistic, adjustment became costly. Other Gulf states illustrate intermediate paths. The United Arab Emirates diversified earlier through services and logistics, relying heavily on private capital and gradual demand formation. Dubai expanded as firms and people arrived, rather than building far ahead of usage. Qatar focused on gas exports and selective investments rather than comprehensive urban transformation. These models differed in scale, but shared a common feature: supply largely followed demand. The consequences of Saudi Arabia's earlier approach became visible on multiple levels. Economically, capital intensity increased without proportional productivity gains. Funds flowed into fixed assets that could not easily adapt when conditions changed. When projects slowed, capital remained immobilized, reducing flexibility during periods of uncertainty. Socially, forced displacement and rapid redevelopment weakened trust. Development was experienced as imposition rather than opportunity. That erosion of social consent carried long-term costs. Even well-designed infrastructure struggles to function when legitimacy is thin. Politically, the stakes rose. Vision 2030 became closely associated with national leadership and identity. Scaling back projects risked being interpreted as retreat rather than recalibration. Each delay carried symbolic weight, amplifying scrutiny at home and abroad. International perception also shifted. Early fascination with ambition gradually gave way to questions about feasibility and execution. Investors focused less on scale and more on governance, timelines, and returns. The narrative moved from spectacle to discipline. Yet comparison also reveals a broader lesson. Saudi Arabia experience is not unique. Across regions and political systems, state-led megaprojects have struggled when speed exceeded institutional capacity. What distinguished this case was not failure, but magnitude. Few countries attempted transformation so quickly, with such concentrated capital and under such intense global attention. The result was not collapse, but recalibration. Vision 2030 exposed the limits of what money alone can accomplish. Diversification emerged not as a financial engineering problem, but as a social and institutional challenge. With these lessons in view, attention turned toward the final question. How could Saudi Arabia adapt its strategy to remain ambitious without repeating the costs of excess? The recalibration of Vision 2030 narrowed Saudi Arabia options, but it did not eliminate them. What changed was not the goal of diversification, but the method and pace required to pursue it. The first adjustment involved capital allocation. Investment increasingly shifted toward sectors where demand already existed and revenue could be measured within years rather than decades. Logistics, mining, data infrastructure, and religious tourism fit this profile. These sectors depended on flows that were already present, not on hypothetical populations or untested urban models. Ports, processing facilities, and digital infrastructure offered clearer paths to cash flow and employment. The second adjustment concerned fiscal management. Sustained deficits signaled that timing mattered as much as ambition. Slowing or resizing selected projects reduced immediate pressure on public finances and preserved flexibility. Oil revenue rather than funding open-ended construction could be used to support transition costs while non-oil sectors matured. This approach did not remove risk, but it extended the time available to manage it. A third shift involved the role of the private sector. Early phases of Vision 2030 placed the state at the center of nearly every initiative. In the revised approach, risk sharing became more prominent. Private capital introduced pricing discipline and operational constraints that public institutions often lacked. Projects unable to attract external investment were increasingly reassessed rather than sustained by default. Institutional reform remained the most difficult challenge. Diversification required skills, regulation, and legal predictability that could not be accelerated through spending alone. Education, labor market participation, and regulatory consistency shaped productivity more reliably than large-scale construction. Progress in these areas was slower and less visible, but its effects accumulated over time. From this point, several future paths became possible. In one scenario, the pivot succeeded. Targeted investments generated steady returns. Mining and logistics integrated Saudi Arabia more deeply into global supply chains. Data infrastructure attracted regional demand. Fiscal pressure eased as non-oil revenue expanded. Vision 2030 survived in a revised form, less dramatic, but more resilient. In another scenario, adjustment arrived too late. Oil prices weakened for an extended period. New sectors grew, but not fast enough to offset sunk costs. Legacy projects continued to absorb capital to preserve credibility. Deficits widened, and policy flexibility narrowed. The most plausible outcome lay between these extremes. Saudi Arabia neither abandoned diversification nor achieved it on the original timetable. Vision 2030 evolved from a deadline into a process. Progress remained uneven, constrained by global conditions and domestic capacity. The measure of success would not be whether every project was completed. It would be whether the economy became less fragile, less dependent on a single commodity, and better able to absorb shocks when conditions changed. That assessment leads naturally to the final question. What does this experience ultimately reveal about ambition, capital, and economic transformation? Vision 2030 was never only an economic program, it was a statement about time. It reflected the belief that a country built on oil could compress decades of transformation into a single generation. For a period, capital made that belief appear achievable. Money moved quickly. Cities were drawn into existence. The future seemed close enough to touch. Reality imposed limits. Gigaprojects revealed the constraints of scale. Social displacement exposed the cost of speed. Fiscal pressure demonstrated that even vast energy wealth is finite. What emerged was not collapse, but friction between ambition and economic structure. The course correction now underway carries a broader lesson. Diversification cannot be purchased outright. It requires productivity, institutions, and social trust. Capital can accelerate change, but it cannot substitute for demand, skills, or legitimacy. When these foundations are weak, even the most ambitious projects struggle to deliver durable value. Saudi Arabia's next phase will likely be quieter, less defined by monumental architecture, and more shaped by logistics networks, mineral processing, data infrastructure, and services tied to existing demand. This path lacks spectacle, but it offers durability. Cash flow replaces symbolism. Adaptability replaces scale. Vision 2030 may no longer resemble its original promise, but its outcome will be judged by a simpler measure: whether the economy becomes more resilient without oil than it was with oil alone. For the viewer, this story extends beyond one country. It illustrates a recurring pattern in economic development. When capital moves faster than institutions, costs accumulate quietly. When ambition confronts constraint, adjustment becomes unavoidable. Understanding these patterns is not academic. They shape how nations allocate resources, manage risk, and define progress. That is why stories like this matter.